We're going to be looking at the earliest civilizations known to man. And we're going to kind of do a wide-ranging survey because, as we mentioned last time when we met on Monday, complex cultures, that's the politically correct term for civilizations. Complex cultures are very rare, and they don't happen. And historically, they have not. They've been the exception rather than the rule. And complex cultures have arisen in several parts of the world at different times in human history. And there's the so-called cradles of civilization, where it's believed that civilizations arose without any kind of external causation, that they just kind of arose in these certain areas.
Sorry to break your
Oh, no, that's all right.
Just so we're keeping honest on this, we really didn't have, as I read this correctly, didn't have a reading assignment last class, so should we put a 3 or a 0 beside it?
A lot of people didn't know where to find the reading assignment, so if everybody puts like a 0, then everybody will get the same thing. So just put 0 for now, unless you did actually go on the daily syllabus and see that there was a reading assignment for today's meeting. Because if you go to the daily syllabus for every day, you'll see a reading assignment.
Yeah, I did. We did that, but there was nothing for us to read last class. So.
Oh, no. This is, you only do it for the reading assignments for today.
Okay, so we put a 0 there.
No, because you could, because you should do. All right, okay, you got today's lecture is the earliest civilizations, and then you go across on the daily syllabus and you'd be a bunch of reading. So from now on, do that reading before you come to class. And then you can, if you just looked at it, you can give yourself a 1. Oh, I looked at it. If you, let's say you read the whole thing and completed it, you give yourself a 3. Let's say you only read like half of it, you give yourself a 2. See what I'm saying? So, I mean, you don't have to, that's how you should just kind of grade it.
So we can just leave this alone there. So we got 2s and 1s there.
Okay, that's fine. Just be honest, that's all you got to do. I mean, it's
well, we wanted to be honest. I didn't mean to hamstring you there.
Oh, you know, that's all right. It's all right. It's a good thing. It's a good question you asked, though. It's a good to ask question. All right, so you got these early civilizations, and we're going to look today at the civilizations that developed in the Western Hemisphere. Now, we're not going in chronological order because we're doing it region by region. So we're going to start with Mexico. The Central Valleys of Mexico and eastern Mexico were one area where indigenous civilization arose. Another area was the coastal area of Peru in South America. Civilization developed there indigenously. Another area of the world are the eastern river valleys of China in East Asia. We're going to look at that. And another area where civilization arose was in what is today Pakistan and India, northern India, along the Indus River Valley. So these are all areas where we see the birth of complex culture. That's why they're called the cradles of civilization. Now, in a later lecture next week, we're going to look at one of the oldest cradles of civilization, and that would be Mesopotamia, what is today Iraq and Turkey and Syria, where they're all killing each other now. That was the earliest cradle of civilization that we know about. But we're going to save that for last. Save the best for last. Save the oldest for last, so to speak. All right. So let's look at, first of all, we're going to begin by looking at the civilizations that developed in Mexico. All right. Now, one thing that's important to remember is that before, in many cases, before you had a complex culture was able to rise, you had to make a serious change in technology. And this change happened at different times around the world, and it's called the Neolithic Revolution. And now, what is the Neolithic Revolution? Well, the Neolithic refers to the technology used, and it means Neolithic means literally New Stone Age. And what we see happening is at different times around the world is that stone tools became more complex and more diverse and more polished. They weren't quite as primitive. So what historians do is that when they look at these artifacts, and archaeologists examine artifacts, they refer to the more primitive tools as being the old Stone Age, Paleolithic. And then when they start to find these new stone tools that are more complex and more polished and of more variety and more sophisticated, they call it the New Stone Age. Now, what historians have noticed is that this change in technology was marked by a radical change in the way that people live their lives. And anytime you have any kind of radical change, it's called that's the best description would be a revolution. Now when we think of revolutions, we often think of something that's very sudden, happens like overnight or over a very short period of time. But in many cases, this transition was something that happened over centuries or even millennia. So it was something that happened over a very long period of time. But if anthropologists are correct and the human species has been around for 200,000 years, a couple thousand years is just a drop in the bucket. But anyway, so we have the Paleolithic and the Neolithic. Now, so what was this big change that occurred? Well, we know that in the Paleolithic period that people were primarily hunters and gatherers. They hunted for food. They gathered wild grasses and wild fruits and berries, whatever they could eat. Probably a big part of their diet was gathering, and so they lived off the land, so to speak. For that reason, they always had to be on the go. The hunters and gatherers are always going to be nomadic. A lot of times when we think of the Paleolithic period, we think of cavemen, because if you're a nomadic person and you're always on the go, a cave is a nice place to live because it's kind of like instant shelter, right? So if you're a nomadic person, it kind of doesn't make a lot of sense to build a big imposing home, since you're always going to be on the move and have to follow the herds and live by the seasons. So that's why Paleolithic hunters and gatherers lived in caves, because they provided ready shelter. And it's amazing. I remember when I was traveling in Greece, and some archaeologists said that there was a cave in northern Greece where the same groups of hunters and gatherers, we don't know if they were the same group, but they dug down into the ground and did some carbon tests of the artifacts, and found that for 20,000 years people went to that cave at different times and lived in that cave. Hunters and gatherers, 20,000 years. Whew. That's pretty amazing if that's true. So you had hunters and gatherers living in caves. They lived in small family groups. Obviously, you're not going to have a huge, giant organization if you're just a bunch of people on the move. So they tended to be organized by families, and maybe a small family or extended family would be one hunter-gathering group. And since you could only own what you could carry, essentially, basically your tools, it made no sense to have lots of possessions. So nobody was any richer than anybody else. So that's what we mean by being egalitarian. Now, in such a society, you always have to have leaders. You always have to have somebody to lead the group. And now, archaeologists and anthropologists have found Paleolithic hunter groups. There are still Paleolithic hunter groups like the Aborigines of Australia or the Kalahari Bushmen of South Africa, who are still living a very primitive lifestyle just maybe 100 years ago, 150 years ago. And people who studied their culture came to certain conclusions. And one of their conclusions was that even in hunters and gatherers, you have to have a leadership. You have to have somebody to take charge. And generally, in these groups of hunters and gatherers, the guy who takes charge is usually the biggest and the strongest and the meanest and the toughest, and the guy who could say, "Let's go kill some animals." The big man, they call it, the big man. That's what they call him in everyday language. Who's the big man? The big man's the guy who says, "Okay, let's go out there and take care of business." Now, it's kind of interesting. They did a study once, and among the Kalahari Bushmen, and they showed that the homicide rate there was higher than even New York City or even Detroit. You think of the big crime areas. The homicide rate was highest among these guys. Killed each other when they got mad at each other. They killed each other like all the time, and so it wasn't. But if you see what happened if somebody killed member of your family, you'd get revenge by killing a member of their family. So that's why you have these pretty large homicide rates. Question?
Did you say killed themselves all the time?
Oh, the Kalahari Bushmen, they did studies and they showed that their homicide rate, the murder rate was very high. Because if somebody got killed, the family would seek revenge, and then they would kill a member of their family for vengeance, and then it would go on, these cycles would go on for a long period of time. One group against another group. So it wasn't, there was a famous, English philosopher who named Thomas Hobbes, who once said that for the most primitive of men, life is brutish and short. And maybe he might have been correct about that. But anyway, so what happened with the Neolithic period? It really changed people's lives. For one thing, with the development of agriculture and domestication of plants and animals, human beings went from being hunters and gatherers to being food producers. They learned how to be more self-sufficient, to live off the land by growing crops and domesticating animals. What this meant was that with the Neolithic Revolution, human beings did not have to travel as much. They didn't have to follow the herds. They could live in one place, which means they could build their own homes. And what we also see is that people had to create storage facilities. So we see the development of pottery, for example, because you need to have some place. If you live in one place, you can accumulate stuff. Anybody who moves to a house and lives there any length of time knows about accumulating stuff. So they accumulate stuff and junk and stuff, and they put it in pottery. Well, what happens is, some people are better at accumulating stuff than others for various reasons. If you're a Marxist, it's because they're better at screwing people over. If you're not a Marxist, it's because they're more fit and better at producing goods. But anyway, so over time you see the development of social classes, or social stratification. Some people have more wealth than others. And this leads to changes in leadership. So what we often see happen is that you begin to see some families that have wealth and property begin to have more influence, and they become maybe a hereditary class of elders or leaders of the group that pass on their wealth and their authority to their heirs. So that's why, and it all links into the Stone Age tools, because you see, if you're living in one place all the time and not dependent on traveling all the time, you have more time to develop your skills as making stone tools. And so that's why all these developments are all linked together and linked to the development of more complicated and more specialized stone tools. So this and what we see happening is across the world, this type of change, this type of revolution had to occur because it set the stage for the development of complex cultures. So this revolution happened at different times in different places. The earliest we know, based on carbon dating, the chemical tests, the earliest we know about this happening would be in the Middle East, in what is today northern Iraq and Turkey, basically about 12,000 years ago. But it didn't happen in Japan till about 300 AD, or no, 300 BC. So just about Japan entered the Neolithic Revolution a little over 2,000 years ago, and but the Middle East entered the Neolithic Revolution something like 12,000 years ago. So it can happen at different times in different places. All right, so let's look at America. And we're going to look at Mexico. All right, now in Mexico, you have two areas which saw the emergence of complex cultures, and they're both areas they can support a population. One area would be the Central Valley of Mexico. You know the Rocky Mountains, right? Rocky Mountains, they start up in Canada, and they go. It's a chain of mountains that goes all the way. Well, it extends into Central America and becomes the Andes in South America. It's a huge, long chain of mountains that runs from north to south, the whole length of North and South America. And I think they're called the Sierra Madre in Mexico. But these mountains have valleys that can support a large population because they're very fertile and have lots of rainfall. Now, another part of Mexico is in southeastern Mexico, and what is today the Yucatan Peninsula and the area, especially the east Gulf Coast of Mexico. You have a situation that there's a lot of volcanic activity. Historically, there's been volcanic activity, and the result is that you have good volcanic soil. Another thing about volcanic rock is that it's very porous, and so what you have in this part of the world is that when it rains during the rainy season, which runs basically through most of the summer, the rain trickles down into the rock, and so you always, if you can find these big reservoirs of water, these huge wells in the rock, you have a very good, steady source of water. So you combine volcanic soil with a good source of water, and you have a recipe for an area that can support a pretty substantial population. And that was certainly the case on the southeast coast of Mexico. Now, the Neolithic Revolution in this part of the world, the best estimate is that it might have began as early as about 8,000 BC. We don't really know. And in Mexico, the crop that was domesticated was corn. You all know the corn on the cob, right? That corn, all corn on the cob that you see today anywhere around the world, it all goes back to that plant is native to Mexico, especially the central valleys of Mexico. And it was domesticated, and they don't really know when exactly. They do these chemical tests when they find bits of old corn when they do excavations, and I've heard reports that as late as 8,000 BC to as early as 8,000 to as late as 5,000 BC. So that's a long range. But at some point, the people in these areas learn how to domesticate corn and raise corn as a crop. Yes?
Going back to the first point there, Mexico, Central Highlands, and the Southeast Coast, did you say that those are the main two areas?
Those are the two areas where we see the development of complex cultures in Mexico. Yeah. Now, now another crop that they think it's only been recently discovered is that there's a crop called cassava. It's a manioc plant. It grows everywhere, but you can eat it. And there's more and more evidence that shows that this was another source of food for the inhabitants, especially in the southeastern parts of Mexico, cassava. So they were able to grow, they were able to domesticate crops, and corn really became the biggest part of their diet. You know, you all heard corn tortillas, right? Tortillas, of course, are probably go back centuries and centuries, and it's like the bread of the indigenous population of Mexico. So they made corn, and but they never in the history of Mexico, they never developed a good, strong draft animal. In Mexico, the draft animal was the human being. They didn't have a huge beast of burden that they could use to carry heavy burdens. But anyway, they did have maize and manioc to feed themselves, so they had to eat lots of corn so they could carry all their heavy burdens. All right, now one of the earliest civilizations to rise was the Olmec civilization located in eastern Mexico. And the earliest evidence for the Olmec civilization dates back to about 2000 BC. So roughly about 4,000 years ago, 2,000 years before Christ.
Now, is this the same period, Dr. Toy, as the Woodland Indian period in North America?
Well, the Woodland period would be a little later, more like about 500, 600 AD. So a little before that. Now, so I think I'm going to get my map working here. Let's see if it does. All right. If you look at a map of Mexico, all these little triangles represent archaeological sites, but the Olmec area is this area right in here. La Venta and San Lorenzo are the two sites that we're going to be talking about a little later. But here, when we're talking about the Olmec, we're talking about this area now. Now, most recent archaeological excavations have shown that other cultures existed that were at the same time as the Olmec. They were also complex cultures, but they were either under heavy Olmec influence or not quite as advanced. So, but the Olmecs were the big game in town. They were the main decisive cultural factor in Mexico in this period. All right, now the Olmecs don't appear they don't appear to have they didn't seem to have an empire, in the sense that it appears that you had a bunch of separate states among the Olmec. They weren't a united empire. They were a bunch of separate states, all grouped around what historians call a ceremonial center. A ceremonial center would be a place where the local population would come together, probably for communal and religious activities. But the Olmec don't appear to be united. Now there's evidence to show that certain ceremonial centers, certain cities, were more powerful than others because of their size, just because of the size of the monuments they built. Maybe they're just show-offs, who knows? But they have the biggest monuments and the biggest cities. And around 1200 BC, the biggest Olmec city was, its modern name is San Lorenzo. We don't know what its ancient name was, but it's the site of San Lorenzo. And around 1200 BC, it was appeared to be the dominant state among the Olmec. But the site of San Lorenzo declined, and by about 900 to about 300 BC or 400 BC, the major Olmec city was La Venta, which was to the east of San Lorenzo. So we don't know the ancient name. Now the Olmecs had a writing system. Archaeologists have determined they did have writing. It just has not been deciphered yet. Now there are some indications that the Olmec writing was the basis or was influenced the development of Maya writing, which we have deciphered, but they have not shown a direct correlation yet. So they did have a system of writing that would be used as the basis for developing new writing systems. We just don't know how to have enough of it to decipher it. Now, the Olmecs, though, like I said, every city was, at the center of the city was what we call a ceremonial center. And the ceremonial center would be a large plaza that would be surrounded or dominated by a pyramid. This would be like they're not pointy like a pyramid, but they'd be like a platform that would be flat on top. And I think I have See, this is an Olmec temple. You see, it's got you got the stone, and it's got brick, and it's got a walkway, and it's flat on the top. That would be your typical platform temple. And this would be a model for later temples, and that would be built by the Maya and in other parts of the New World. But that would be the Olmec pyramid, yes.
Do you think that these pyramid centers is what gave rise to the ceremonial mounds in North America? The reason I ask is, you hear the typical North Americans came here by the Bering Strait, yada, 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 but Native American culture says just the opposite. Native American culture holds that the Native American population came up from South America. And there's a lot of evidence to say that, too, that because of our ceremonial mounds and the way that the early North American cultures were situated very similar to this, and the maize production, and they've established trade routes back and forth to South America.
Yeah, there is some people, most people do believe that both corn and ceremonial centers that you see here that we see in places like Cahokia in Mississippi. This is much later, this is like 900 AD, after Christ, were influenced by developments in Mexico. So there was trade. Whether they were the descendants of migrants, I don't. Theorists don't believe that, but there was definitely a cultural link there.
When I say Native American tradition, I'm talking about amongst the 5 civilized tribes.
Yeah.
Plains Indians and stuff don't hold that.
Yeah. Well, everybody's got their own traditions, I suppose. All right, so that's now the thing about this is that many people think that with the way that these ceremonial centers were constructed was that the plaza or the square served as a place of observation. So and the platforms were built in such a way so that ritual activities that took place on these platforms could be seen by a large population. That's why they're called ceremonial centers, in the sense that people would come and from all the surrounding villages to this place, congregate in the plaza, and they would be able to see these activities take place. And so this leads to lots of speculation. One belief, in order to have these monumental structures, and you need to have some kind of organization. You need to have a government. You need to have some kind of surplus to support the population. The people who are building these monumental buildings, the architects, the craftsmen, they all need to be fed. So you have to have some kind of system in place to collect food and provide food and organize these activities. So many historians believe that in the case of the Olmec, that you had a class of priests or rulers who were in charge of the ceremonial activities, who collected corn, collected food in the form of taxes, collected taxes in kind, and used that surplus of agricultural goods to organize construction activities and supply the needs of craftsmen and other specialized workers. And so such a system was in place. And some people believe that they might even have evidence of a priest king. Now, at the site of Laventa, for some reason, they decided that they find all these giant heads. Here's one of these giant heads. They're as big as a man. They're 6 feet tall. Now, each one of these giant heads weighs about 60 tons. And they were quarried. We know where they were quarried, from what stone. The quarry at Laventa is about a good 40 miles away from where these stones were placed. So somehow they were carved these huge 60-ton stone blocks and transported them miles and miles to set them up at Laventa. And so the theory is that these stones could represent maybe kings. Maybe they were ruled by priest kings, and these are their kings. Or they might be gods. We don't really know for sure who these heads are. It's interesting they had just floating heads, but that's what they did. Now another reason why they think they had a king, some kind of priest king, was that in later periods of time, the major god that was worshipped in this area was a god named Tlaloc. Tlaloc was the rain god, and he was when the Spanish arrived in southern Mexico, they heard all about Tlaloc. He was the local big shot god in southern Mexico, and his symbol was the jaguar. Now, people who look at Olmec sites find a lot of jaguar motifs. There's a lot of jaguars are depicted in Olmec art. So they think that this would seem to indicate that Tlaloc, he might have been known by a different name at the time, but they had a jaguar god. Now, another thing about the jaguar was that in later Mexican cultures, he was always linked to royalty. Just like a lion is a symbol of royalty in the West, the jaguar is the symbol of royalty in Mexico. So that one theory is that the Olmecs had some kind of priest king represented by the jaguar, who was linked to the major deity, the rain god Tlaloc. And it makes sense. People generally worship whatever is their bread and butter. Sad to say. And they really relied on rain, and that's why in many cultures, a rain god is a god. You want to make sure that you have lots of rain, so you make sure you worship the rain god. Today we're worried about global warming, so we pay Al Gore millions of dollars to tell us how bad global warming is. Now our god is people like our former senator from Tennessee. But back then, you would have had the priest king say, "If you don't honor Tlaloc, we will not have the rain. You must give us your corn so we can sacrifice to the Tlaloc, the great god." And everybody would say, "Oh, oh!" And they all give up their gold and whatever they had to the priest king, and he'd say, I will use my influence with Tlaloc to save you! And they'd be like, oh, amen, hallelujah. So, things haven't changed that much, have they? But anyway.
Sunday morning TV.
So that's what, now that's all speculation because we don't, like I said, we don't know what the Olmec writing has not been deciphered, so nobody's left from Olmec culture, so we don't know, we haven't interviewed anybody from Olmec culture. So all this is just based on evidence that we have from later civilizations and later cultures and kind of trying to figure out what was going on there. All right. Now, another important area is where we see the rise of complex culture is in Peru. And now, this would be an area, what you see is remember those Rocky Mountains, which these guys, they go all the way down south, and they go through Central America, and they become, in South America, the Andes. And what happens is that when the snow melts and the spring rains come, you have river valleys form, and all the river valleys in Peru flow from the mountains in the east to the west coast. So if you go to Peru today, you'll find river valley after river valley after river valley, and they all are dependent upon melting snow and rain in the Andes Mountains. Now, the thing about the coast of Peru is it's very hot and dry. It's very desert-like. It has a climate not that much different than Southern California. So it does get rain, but not very much rain. So this area is dependent upon rain and snow in the mountains to provide water for the region. Now, when these rivers are alluvial rivers in the sense that when they flow down from the mountains, they bring soil from the mountains with them. So along the rivers, these rivers in Peru, the soil is very fertile. And it's that fertility of that soil that could support us or support a substantial population. Now, this part of the world, we know that the Neolithic Revolution, we're not really sure exactly when, but one estimate is about 7,000 BC. But the first crop that the first agricultural good that they domesticated was squash. And you all know man cannot live by squash alone. Sorry, that was a bad joke. But anyway, squash. I hate squash. It's when I have to throw tons of butter on it to make it edible. I don't know, but does anybody like squash? I'm sorry. But if you put a lot of garlic and salt and butter on it, it's great.
My grandmother makes this like a cornmeal or something on it, like it's like got a little breading on it or something.
Oh yeah, breading is good. Yeah.
Like
But this is
fried
great
green
squash. What?
It's kind of like fried green tomatoes when you fry them
Yeah.
like that.
Or you can put cinnamon and butter and sugar on it.
There you go. But who eats plain squash? But these people did. Now they probably seasoned it in their own way, but they ate lots of squash. Now, over time, though, they learned other crops. Like, for example, Indian corn from Mexico was introduced somewhere between 3000 and 2000 BC, and that became a major part of their diet. Another thing that was in Peru, in the highlands of Peru, potatoes were first domesticated. You know, all potatoes today, all your French fries go back to the valleys of the Andes Mountains. That's where they're indigenous to. But somewhere around 2000 BC, in the highlands of Peru, in the mountains, they domesticated potatoes. So you get corn and potatoes and squash. And then up in the mountains of the Andes, the people, they did have a pack animal. They did have a beast of burden. In South America, it's the llama. The llama would be used for not just for carrying burdens, but will also be used as food, llama steaks, and llama milk, and llama wool. They use wool. Now, there's a smaller version of a llama called an alpaca, which is the size of a goat. And the alpaca was also used, not so much as a beast of burden because it's small, but for its meat and its wool. And so the llama and alpaca by about 3000 BC became a very important part of the lifestyle of the people who lived in the Peruvian highlands and eventually the coast of Peru. Now, it's been known, it's become known only just recently that you had an advanced civilization that developed at a very early stage in Peru. Archaeologists in the maybe last 20 years have excavated. It's in the Supe Valley of Peru, and it's at a place called Caral. And they found an archaeological site that proved that as early as about 2600 BC, and this is all based on carbon-based testing. If you don't ask me how they do carbon-based testing, because I'm not a chemist. I used to know, but I forgot. Anyway, you can ask Professor Osborne or Cleveland, who are chemists, to ask them how that works. But chemical testing shows that by 2600 BC, over 4,000 years ago, you have this great city at Caral. Now, at Caral, they built pyramids. Now, they used a very interesting way of constructing pyramids. They would collect bunches. It appears what they did is they collected all this stone using nets, and then they would take a bunch of nets and rock and stack them together. That's how they built their pyramids, which was they didn't use stone blocks or mud brick like would be later used in later pyramids, but they used this unique construction method. And some of the pyramids are huge. There's one pyramid at Caral that its base is the size of 2 football fields. It's about 600 feet. And it's 5 stories high. So it's like 60 feet high and 600 feet wide. I mean, that's a pretty monumental construction task. Now, another thing that's interesting about this Caral is they found these huge sunken courts. They would dig holes into the ground and create like an area. Now, they don't know what purpose, but they're thinking that maybe it serves some kind of ceremonial purpose. Remember we talked about ceremonial centers? They can't think of any other reason why they built these huge, giant, sunken courts. But I want you to remember those sunken courts because they'd be built by subsequent cultures in the region. Now, some of the pyramids were used, we're not really sure, but maybe for ritual purposes. Some of the pyramids were places where domestic buildings were placed. So it's interesting that would be the case. But that would appear to indicate that if somebody's building a house on a huge pyramid, what would you say about the status of that person? Was he important or not important?
It was important.
Yeah, if you're living on top of a pyramid and everybody else isn't, you're probably pretty important. Yeah. So that would be a sign of what? We have some people more important than others. What? Social stratification.
That's another similarity between the ancient Native American cultures.
Yeah, that's true.
Same thing.
And the mound builders did the same thing. Now, interesting thing about Caral is that it's pre-corn. They didn't have corn or potatoes. So they had squash, but they didn't have corn or potatoes. So they have found that they were able to harvest fish from the sea. Now, this Caral is located very close to the ocean, and for some reason they were able to harvest huge amounts of fish. So they ate a lot of fish and a lot of squash. And this highlights a point that some historians are beginning to realize is that you don't necessarily have to have a real important staple like corn or potatoes or wheat to have an advanced complex culture. These people were able to have a surplus of food and build these monumental construction buildings without a staple in their diet, without corn, potatoes, obviously just fish and squash work, unless there's something we don't know about. But pretty advanced civilization there. All right. Now,
How long did they live to be, and what was their lifespan like?
I mean, it's hard. What you'd have to do is you'd have to find a bunch of different bones of their dead, like a burial ground, and then you could maybe do an estimate of the typical age of the people who died, and then you could do that. People have done those kind of studies, but I'm not aware with this particular case.
What's the word beside of Caral there?
I think you pronounce it Supe.
Supe. And
That's Spanish.
What is that again? Is that the?
That's the river valley that it's in.
Okay.
It's in all the early Peruvian cultures are located in these river valleys. Either they're in the highlands or in the river valleys.
Okay.
I think most of the estimates of most South American cultures are saying in their mid-40s, wasn't it?
Well, that's pretty much based on typical early pre-industrial societies in general, you know. But when they always say that, you always remember when you read any kind of studies like that, people, I think 2,000 years ago, there were people who lived to be 80 back then. There were people who lived older than that. When they talk about typical age of dying, they mean that that's when you average out, you know, all the different times that people die. And what brings it down is you had lots amount of child mortality. A lot of children died. Well, typically in like even pre-industrial America in the 18th century, if a family had 10 kids, only 2 or 3 would make it to adulthood. Most of them would die of some disease or whatever, get killed by wild animals or whatever. I mean, the mortality rates for pre-industrial societies are pretty bad. That's why women would have 9, 10, 11 children, because there was a good chance that most of those children weren't going to make it to adulthood, just because of the disease or whatever. All right. Now, I wanted to bring out something here. You mentioned mound builders and you mentioned Native American cultures in North America. I wanted to link something. I mentioned that at Corral, they were able to build these monumental structures, even though they didn't have like a staple diet. They didn't have like potatoes or corn or anything like that. And there's a comparative culture up in Louisiana, of all places, that is very similar. It's called in that regard. Up in northern Louisiana, there's a place called Poverty Point, and this, for lack of a better name, is called Poverty Point culture. Poverty Point's the location of the site, and it's a huge earthworks. Here's a diagram of it. It's this huge diagram. It looks like a half C. These are huge ridges that were built up. And just to give you an idea of scale, you see this mound here on the bottom here? This one right here? These 2 mounds are 600 feet in size. So, I mean, this little area here is like 600 feet. So imagine this is just a giant area. And testing of it shows that this huge earthworks was built in about less than 10 years. And it was built about 1700 BC. Now, this Poverty Point culture, all we know is they built these huge earthworks. They had artifacts. They had a lot of jewelry. A lot of the jewelry have bird themes, like bird pendants, bird-shaped figurines. The only clue they have is that among the Chippewa who lived in that part of the world, when Europeans first arrived, birds represented the spirits of the dead or spirits in general. So it's thought with all these bird pendants and this huge monument. One of these mounds you see it's an effigy mound. It's a mound in the shape of something, and it's a mound in the shape of a bird with wings outstretched. So it's a mound in the shape of a giant bird.
Raven was a North American goddess as well.
Who?
Raven was a North American goddess as well.
So they built this thing over 3,000 years ago, and the only reason I'm mentioning it's another case where they were able to build this massive building, this massive earthworks. Must have had lots of food to do it, but they had no agriculture. This is pre-corn. We know that the people who lived here ate a lot of fish, and some people think that they must have found a way to harvest fish in large enough numbers to produce all the fish bones they found. So it's right on the river. It's right on near the Mississippi River, the Delta area. So they were able to live off the Delta and with fish, and they lived off they ate weeds. So a lot of things that we think of as weeds, you heard of dandelion wine. Well, they ate weeds like crazy. It was part of their diet, and so they were able to create these monumental constructions and build these buildings without having a staple in the diet. This is pre-Neolithic revolution. But they were able to raise a surplus. They must have found some kind of technology. One theory is that they found a way to do mass kills of fish, because there's no way you can do a traditional bait and fish, to collect as much fish as they did. So they think they must have found a way of muddying the waters to kill the fish, and then harvesting the fish, and so they have enough fish to support their large populations. But we don't know.
Any evidence of any kind of like hatcheries or dammed areas?
Yeah, well,
Most of the delta had been washed away.
yeah, exactly. But they found a way. But I mentioned it because it's another example. And when we get to Turkey, when we're talking about the Middle East, there's more signs that that before Neolithic Revolution, before you have agriculture, you can still build monumental buildings. But here again, we're not really sure why they build it, but the bird theme in the effigy mound and in all the jewelry that has been discovered would seem to indicate if comparative studies with Native Americans is true, that maybe it had something to do with religion, or the spirits of the gods, or the spirits of the dead represented by the bird themes. You can see kind of like this is the Poverty Point culture right here in the United States. So I mention that just because it's a link in the sense that now these cultures probably didn't have any contact. One was in Peru and one was in Louisiana, but they both were able to create monumental constructions, even though they did not have a staple diet. They didn't have like a corn or potatoes or wheat as a staple in their diet. All right, now what we see happening in Peru, getting back to Peru now, is that you see a continuity in the sense that the later cultures that established themselves after the Corral culture kind of built on the achievements. Like there's at Second Alto, that's the modern name. It's also in an adjacent river valley. They found evidence of complex culture, and this what they found at Second Alto, it's what they call it it's called a U-shaped center. Like a U-shape is that they have a giant pyramid, like they're at Second Alto. There's a pyramid that's 160 feet tall, and then they have a pyramid at the base of the U, and then a pyramid at both sides of it, and then they have a huge sunken court. So at the middle of the U is a sunken court surrounded by pyramids. Now it's thought that building a sunken court at the base of these three pyramids would make it even more dramatic how tall and impressive the pyramids would be. Now what's interesting at Second Alto was that they decorated their pyramids, but in a way that would be very bizarre. They decorated their pyramids with disembodied body parts. I mean, stone body parts, arms and legs, and heads disembodied. And it's very strange. And one theory is that the ceremonies that took place at Second Alto may have involved ritual human sacrifice and dismemberment. And the reason why they think that is because we know that as late as the Inca, that was a practice in this part of the world. Human sacrifice was, and where you kill somebody and then kind of dismember the body, remove the head or remove the limbs. That was common in Latin America, what is today Latin America, before the arrival of Europeans. So the discovery of all these sculptured body parts at Second Alto would seem to suggest that human sacrifice and ritual dismemberment was a ancient practice going back more than 3,000 years. Now, so far we've looked at these different cultures that arose in Peru. But in around 800 BC, there arose what was considered to be the first empire, the empire of Chavín. And the name Chavín is named from what is one of the biggest sites. Chavín was located not in the river valleys, but up in the Andes, and it was a huge site. At its height, from about 800 BC, it probably had a population in the thousands. And they built, the Chavín people, get this link to work, they built their pyramids and they built their palaces on top of mountains. They built these monumental walls and platforms to build their palaces and temples, and here's an example of it right here. And now it's called the First Empire because they found Chavín artifacts all across Peru, in both the highlands and in the river valley. So it would indicate that if it wasn't an empire, Chavín was the dominant cultural center over a wide swath of area in Peru. Now, what's interesting about Chavín is that it was located in the highlands, but in their artwork, in their sculptures, in their vases, in their artwork, they all portrayed jungle creatures, jaguars, snakes, birds from the jungle. Now, you know, the Peruvian highlands is not jungle. It's pretty cold in the wintertime, and it's not too hot in the summer. So what is fascinating is, why would a people building an empire in Peru and being based in the highlands have all this artwork and artifacts that would indicate that they were at home in the jungle? Now, a lot of the artwork shows animal, men, weird creatures that are half snake and half men, or half jaguar and half men. And so it's believed that perhaps Chavín was ruled by the people who had these artifacts were some kind of maybe priest warriors types whose power was based on their control of the spirits. Some people believe because of the psychedelic nature of some of these illustrations and sculptures, it's even thought that maybe these priest kings were imbibing some mushrooms or something to have kind of spiritual experiences because of the nature of these interesting sculptures that come from Chavín. But anyway, the one theory is that the Chavín, one reason is that maybe they had all this jungle stuff, all these jungle theme, is that maybe they were from the jungle, that they had migrated to the Peruvian highlands, perhaps from the Amazon. Now you might think, the Amazon? How could they come from the Amazon? Amazon's not the home of big populations. But there you're wrong. In just the last 20 or 30 years, they've discovered that the Amazon rainforest was at one time very heavily populated with big cities. And the only reason they discovered it is because with that, with radar, you can fly over large areas, and they found the outlines of walls and canals and cities in the Amazon. And today it's very sparsely populated. It's all jungle. But there was a time, thousands of years ago, when the Amazon obviously was heavily populated. So perhaps the Chavín were maybe migrants from the Amazon who moved into the mountains, the highlands of the Andes, and were able to conquer and establish their rule over a wide area of the Peruvian coast and build this first great empire. It would be the first in a series of empires, culminating in the mighty Inca Empire by the 16th century and just previous to the arrival of the Spanish and Europeans.
To lend credence to that theory, in the Spanish logs, there are references to magnificent cities in the Amazon. Everybody thought that was a bunch of baloney. But now they have actually found evidence of those magnificent cities that the Spanish were recording.
Yeah, well, they haven't done any excavations yet, so there's still some skepticism. It's just based on the fact that you have planes and they can do radar, and they're the ones finding what appears to be canals and walls and that were in ruins. Now, one theory is that the epidemic diseases that were brought by Europeans after the 16th century killed off much of the population of the Amazon. And that's why it became such a, basically deserted of human inhabitants in the last several hundred years. All right. So what I'd like to do now, we're going to take a break for a second here. And what I'd like to do is, in your groups over the next, let's say, 5 or so minutes, we talked about how ideology, technology, environment, and competition all play a role in the rise of complex cultures. Now, based on what we've just looked at, Mexico and Peru, try to think of some ways in which these different elements came into play in establishing these civilizations. So I'm not going to call on all of you, but I'm going to call on some of the groups to give me some answers. So just kind of over the next 5 minutes, just talk amongst yourselves and try to come up with a couple of ways in which any of these factors played a role in the rise of Mexico and civilizations in Mexico and Peru. So you guys, in your groups, talk about that. And if you need to use the restroom or something like that, this is the time to do it.
Yeah, I was watching it. I was listening to
We're all in groups. Hey, here's group number 8. You all clear? Okay. Well, once you have dude, you're going to be in group 8. All right, so try to write down, okay, the importance of, well, how did ideology, technology, environment, and computation think? Just try to think of some ways in which these elements came into play in the writing of Mexico's group.
It's like everybody's shooting, they're not gonna I'll write down what I'm saying.
You guys write everything down? Good, good. Always got that something to write down. Ask you a question.
Environment suitable for led per hour.
You're saying that's not all that it is. Yeah, right. Your quality is competition for and we compete against the other water.
I've already
All right, guys, let's go ahead. I'm just going to pick a group randomly and give you some answers here. All right, number 6. Who's number 6? What do you got, number 6? What will be some ways in which these different factors come into play?
Ideology, we came up with religion playing a major role in that, as well as, and I don't know how much this will affect it, but people traveling from one area to the next, maybe carrying these ideals from one place to the next.
Okay, so what would be an example of an ideology or in a specific case?
Like one of their buildings that they made, like the pyramids and whatnot, and all the buildings they made all of them had religious meanings and.
So they
I mean, most of these temples and things, that was for religion, right? I mean, that was the basic.
Well, that's the theory. So that would be ideology played a role in getting complex monumental buildings constructed. That's right. Anybody else? Let's see, number 2. Where's number 2? What do you got?
Along with what they're talking about, the ideology, people's ideas. A lot of times the ideas can migrate, like they were talking about, like what we were speaking of, a lot of ideology that they believe that became what's North American came from South America. So it can migrate. They've also found archaeological evidence that trade routes established between Gulf Coast Indians and Florida came from South America, like the T-bird idea.
Now, what would be now you mentioned ideology, but what would be when you have different cultures kind of influencing each other and one influence another? What do you call that among these 4 things? It's not just ideology; it's peer polity. That's right. That's right.
So, but in backing that up, the technology a lot of times is developed in order to support the ideology, and it's used the environment like you've got there. For instance, Chavin. Chavin is up in the mountains, so therefore they utilized what they had technologically in the mountains to build their. Then the ones down in the plains did the same thing, used earthworks instead of stone. And then you had the ones that used massive stones instead of the gathered stones.
Yeah.
And in North America, it's the same way. Our 5 civilized tribes, the Chalagi actually lived in log homes. They didn't live in teepees, because they had woods to build their homes out of.
That's right. So they all.
So it affects everything.
So what your environment will impact how you build things, and that's true. That's a good point. All right. Anybody else want to add something they came up with that hasn't been said already? Anybody want to add something?
Sacrificial ceremonies be more into sort of like ideology?
Yeah, that would be a way. An ideology is just a way of looking at the world. So if you think that you have to sacrifice somebody to get what you want, or to honor the powers that be in the universe, that would be an ideology. Yeah. So what would be an example where they think they might have practiced human sacrifice?
Up in Peru.
Second altar.
Yeah.
Remember, like when you guys are writing your essays, or you're getting ready to do an assignment, or when you're getting ready to do an exam, you always have to have those specific examples to back up what you're saying. You just can't say, well, they built pyramids. Well, you have to say where, when, and where did they build pyramids? You always just give them a specific example in your head. So when you talk about sacrifice, you mentioned second altar, 1300 BC. They have sculptures of dismembered bodies, obviously an indication of human sacrifice. See what I'm saying? So remember that that's how you substantiate a position, is by always citing specific evidence to support what you're saying, and trying to avoid being too general or too ambiguous. And so that's just something to think about. All right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move to China. Well, we're not going to move to China. We're going to stay here. But we are going to move in our minds to China. Now, China, the river valleys of China are yet another cradle of civilization. All right, and you have 2 main rivers in China. In the north it's called the Yellow River. It's often referred to, but it's the Huang River. I cannot pronounce Chinese for the life of me, so if you're a Chinese speaker, please excuse my ignorance. And then in the south, it's the Yangtze River. Now, both these rivers have their origins in, believe it or not, the Himalayas, the mountains in Central Asia. And they flow from west to east, and both of these rivers dump themselves into the Pacific Ocean. But it's a situation very similar to what we saw in Peru. It's a much vaster scale, where you have these rivers bring along with them sediment. They bring soil along with them from the mountains, from the uplands, and this soil is deposited on the riverbanks. So the river valleys are very, very fertile. So that's why you have civilizations developing in very fertile river valleys. Now, one thing that people don't realize is that China, they speak different languages in China. I mean, they're related ethnically, but a lot of times these different languages reflect the geographical differences. Northern China, especially the Yellow River Valley, especially in the northwestern parts of China, its climate is very similar to the Midwest. Very, very cold winters and very hot and humid summers. So it's a very temperate climate. The southern river, the Yangtze River, flows through an area that is very tropical, very hot. It doesn't really have cold winters. It doesn't snow. It's just and in these two river valleys, in these two parts of China, to this day, they speak two different languages. In the south, it's known to Westerners as Cantonese. In the north, it's known to Westerners as Mandarin. Now, a Mandarin Chinese and a Cantonese Chinese, if they speak to each other, will not understand each other. I mean, they might, over time, kind of figure out what the other person is saying. But they're two different languages, as much as different as, let's say, Dutch and English. You know, both Dutch and English are Germanic languages, but if you ever heard a Dutch person speak, you'd probably be like, what are you saying? Now, if you talk to them, listen to that Dutch person over time, you know, every time you start to figure out, oh yeah, your language is a lot like mine. It might take you a while, but they're related languages, and the same thing is true in China. Northern Chinese and the Southern Chinese speak different languages, even though they're related to each other. They're very similar but different. Now, and it reflects the different environments in the north and the south. In northern China, along the Huanghe or Yellow River, the main crop that they domesticated was millet. You can make bread out of millet. In the south, in the south of China, along the Yangtze River, it was rice. In the north, they had cattle. In the south, they had water buffalo. Water buffalo. I should have put a picture of a water buffalo. They're the funniest looking thing. Now the Neolithic Revolution in China, I'm not exactly sure when it happened, but based on those chemical tests we mentioned, the best guess is somehow between 7,000 and 4,000 BC, they, in the river valleys of China, they began to domesticate plants and animals. Rice probably was domesticated the earliest in the south and southern parts of China. You know, rice you can't really grow in a northern environment. I mean, you can only grow it in a hot, tropical-like environment. But anyway, so rice and millet. Now the first complex cultures that have been identified in China are the, I hate China, Huangzhou in the south along the Yangtze River, and the Huangshan in the north along the Yellow River.
And these were the major civilizations?
These were the first known complex cultures in China, and they're different. The Langzhou culture, they're both Stone Age cultures because stone at this period continued to be the Neolithic cultures in the sense that stone continued to be used as the major basis of weapons and tools. Now, the reason why we know they're complex is in the case of both, and the Langzhou in particular, is because of the tombs. They found elaborate tombs with pottery and jade figuring. Jade is I think it's a kind of stone, I think. I'm not really sure what jade is. You know anybody know what jade is?
It's stone.
It's stone. And it's always been very, very popular stone in China, even today. And it's very, and jade sculptures were a big part of Chinese culture all throughout its history. But jade was obviously very important to the Neolithic population of the Langzhou. So and so having these elaborate tombs, what do elaborate tombs for an archaeologist? What do they signify in terms of culture? Remember my video? I made that video to help you remember. Da 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 da. And watch that video, kind of get in your head. So tombs equals what?
Air quality.
No. It's more way I could, but
In social structure.
social structure, because not everybody gets an elaborate tomb, right? So if you get an elaborate tomb, that means you're special. And if some people are more special than others, what does that mean? That's social stratification. So you have some people who are wealthy and some people of high social status, they get elaborate tombs. If you're just some peasant, some common person, they throw you in the ground. That's see you later, buddy. Please dump you in the dirt.
I know if you were a slave and
Uh-huh.
or if you were a leader and you had a slave, your slaves were sacrificed with you.
Well, that's true in the later cult in the Shang dynasty. We'll get to that hopefully. Maybe not today, but we will talk about that. Now, so and they've even found what they think might be evidence of writing. They're not really sure. They haven't deciphered it yet, but they found etchings on pottery from the Langzhou culture that the only thing they can only be is some kind of writing system. So very early on, there might have been, even in Neolithic China, there might have been some kind of writing system. Now,
You said that was etched on pottery?
yes, and they don't know what it is. Some people think, oh, it's not, it's just decorative, it's not writing. And other people say, no, it's writing. So it's a big debate among Chinese historians. Now, to the north, the Longshan culture is a little bit different in terms of the artifacts. But it's, again, our major reason why we think it was complex was because of the tombs. Some people had very elaborate tombs, but also this pottery. Now, I have evidence of their pottery. Their pottery, they produced this very fine pottery that showed, to produce this pottery, you had to know something. You had to really know how to fire pottery and do it right, which would indicate what aspect of a complex culture? When you have skilled craftsmen. Specialization, or technology would be part of it, but specialization. Obviously, they had people who were potters who passed on their skills and their training to their pupils over time, over many centuries. So because they produced this very fine pottery. So the Longshan culture was in the north. Now, both of these cultures are what we call Neolithic cultures because at this time, stone continued to be the main material used to make tools and weapons. See if I can get this map to work. All right. No, it's not happening. I think I got it. All right. Here we go. Let me see if I can get a nice map for you here. All right. So, just kind of put things in perspective. The rivers that would be right in this area right here. The rivers both have their origins here in the mountains, and they flow through China, and they come very close to each other here just before they never meet, but they come very close to each other here along the coast of China, along the Pacific. All right, now, what we see happening is about 2000 BC, we see the introduction of bronze. Now, bronze is a product. If you add tin and copper, you create bronze. It's an alloy. And bronze technology was partly introduced to China from outside. But we know that bronze was first invented over in the Mesopotamia, to the far to the west, and it's thought that over trade routes across the steppes of Central Asia, knowledge of how to make bronze was introduced to China. And after 2000 BC, bronze replaced stone as the premier material to make to make weapons and tools. So bronze, that's why when we talk about the history of China, 2000 BC marks the beginning of the so-called Bronze Age. Now, I want to close this with a great story. The Chinese historians the earliest Chinese historians lived about 200 BC. And the ancient Chinese historians, in their books, describe these ancient dynasties, these ancient families of emperors that ruled China thousands of years before their time. Now, when Western historians first discovered these writings and began to study them, they said, oh, well, how could somebody living in 200 BC know about or remember an empire that existed in 2000 BC? Obviously, these are legends and stories, and they're not real, because there's just no way they could. Well, according to these ancient Chinese historians, the Xia dynasty, XIA, the Xia dynasty was one of the great dynasties that established an empire about 2000 BC, about 2,000 years before their time. And nobody believed it. All the Western historians were thinking, oh, this is a bunch of crap. This is just a bunch of legends. Can't be real. How would they know about these ancient empires? Well, according to Chinese tradition, the capital of the Xia dynasty was a place called Erlitou. What happens? Archaeologists went to Erlitou, and they found a city. And the city, based on the studies, the chemical tests and all that, this city flourished about 2000 BC. So the Chinese historians had it right all along, and this was the physical proof that people needed. So just because a tradition is a tradition doesn't mean you have to reject it out of hand. But anyway, so we're going to talk about the Bronze Age civilizations of China and India, and we're going to do that next time. Question?
When did you say bronze was introduced in China?
Oh, about 2000 BC. It's usually associated with the rise of the Xia dynasty.
Okay, and I have one more question.
Yes.
I'm having some issues with
Let me turn this off first. I'm listening.